Why the cause to identify? Many times, the experience we humans have is associated with a doer, or someone that thinks, performs tasks. If you notice every time you think, there's a sense of I who thinks, and if the thought has any relevance, its meaning and direction it points in is believed to or followed through with. Very rarely do we view our thoughts popping up as just thoughts, without any meaning or substance. If we have a thought to speak or walk to the supermarket, a high chance arises that we do not recognize that in that moment, we are awareness watching this thought, as well as who that seems to identify with it. The problem comes when thoughts are being automatically identified with, especially when they are harmful and non-helpful, not only to ourselves but also the people around us. The automatic urge to identify with thoughts and follow their meaning is the egoic identity. The ego is an energetic body. Like all living organisms, it has a consciousness of its own. The ego, which many unfortunately assume is not someone who is just arrogant or big-headed. The ego is an energetic body intent on drawing in your consciousness to believe that it is you. To make things clear, you are pure consciousness, not the personality or conditioning of the mind. The conditioning of the mind, no matter what it is the stomping ground of the ego as such. Thoughts that provoke disturbance to the identity have the most power over your consciousness and making you believe or act on them. This is what fuels and makes up the ego identity. When we identify with thoughts, we assume that there is a thinker, that this space of where we think is a space we also are. Yet this space is separate from thought. So why do we identify with thought? Why does a part of the mind tend to follow itself, like a cat or a dog that is hunting its own tail? Why would we identify with a phenomenon we can see, and clearly see its destructive nature? If you meditate or understand intuitively that you are beyond thought, you will notice thoughts coming for your attention, coming with more deception to pull you into an identified state. This is the energetic body of the ego that lives through the attention you give it. It cannot live without you, so when you attempt to disidentify, it will attempt to deceive you. In the very nature that it appears to be you that is getting deceived or harassed by the mind. When we see for once that it is deceiving itself and an entity of its own, we step off the merry-go-round that has us believing that thoughts are our thoughts and that they don't come out of nowhere. We see that we have the power to give thoughts life, so long as we are conscious enough to not get sucked into the belief that these thoughts hold. A faint but simple rationality begins to appear when we bridge the gap between I and I think. It is and comes to us as a knowing that these thoughts are not passing for an actual person, but instead for a concept that we identify with. Strong and clear detachment with non-identification begins when we really meditate and connect back to pure consciousness. If it weren't for our pure awareness, life as we usually perceive it wouldn't exist. So when we become what watches our attention, thoughts that pop up have no energy to draw our attention. To make you identify with them, so-called meaningful or emotion-charged thoughts will appear in order for the ego to maintain its existence within your consciousness. Since your personality derives from the ego, detachment from it becomes increasingly difficult when the ego is hanging on for dear life. If it weren't for pure awareness, life as we usually perceive it wouldn't exist. So when we become what watches our attention, thoughts that pop up have no energy to draw our attention. To make you identify with them, so-called meaningful or emotion-charged thoughts will appear in order for the ego to maintain its existence within your consciousness. Since your personality derives from the ego, detachment from it becomes increasingly difficult when the ego is hanging on for dear life. It will portray itself as a friend one minute and your enemy the next, to get your concern and belief in its thought. Since all thoughts are temporary, its goal is to make you believe that thoughts are who you are. Its goal is to prove its existence so that you identify straying from the present moment and become a thought based in the future or past. Time isn't always a destructive concept. It's actually very useful. that only through non-attachment to thoughts can you remain present while doing so. You won't be daydreaming about a past regret or anticipating a certain event. You can let life play from the very moment all perceived concerns appear. And normally, when you are not happy with the present moment, it is most likely the ego's energy pushing an agenda that may be leaning towards portraying the past or future as better. This seems appealing to the mind at first, as you are quickly avoiding whatever dilemma you need to face in the present moment. Though avoiding the present moment makes the future and the past more inviting for the mind to portray as something you want to go to, and therefore you neglect the present moment, which is where you can actually create real and lasting happiness, and not have to come back to whatever concern you didn't want to face immediately. When you learn to be present head-on, it not only makes now more enjoyable in a place of mind, but also makes you beg to wonder whether not following any distractive thought, enticing as it may be at first, was actually the result for happiness. The present moment won't always be a place to enjoy just by experiencing thought. A lot of people that live or are going through a stressful situation want to stop their mind, though the problem with this is that it has to be done by a force which is again by thought. What actually will serve you is the acceptance of thought. If you've ever listened to Alan Watts, he talks about imagining thoughts as just sounds, no different from the birds or the outside world, just sound. Another method, although it isn't really a method, is disassociating until thoughts and pulls from the mind just appear through the space, commonly known as consciousness or emptiness. The mind often makes out consciousness or emptiness to be a bland concept where nothing actually happens, though this view itself appears as an illusion within consciousness. When you disidentify from thoughts, you can clearly see any negative or positive overtones or attitudes towards thoughts. It creates a neutrality that after a while allows you to just observe and smile at the negative thoughts. When thoughts don't turn into emotions or moods, it means you've reached the right space in which thoughts don't have time to connect to the ego entity before they are made aware of. Similar to just the practice of meditation, you can actually enter social events with consciousness being the place from which you operate. Your personality won't have the dualistic mentality it used to have about others or places being positive or negative. The ego biases become obvious and watchable to you. The reason the ego cannot just be in a pleasant state is because its fears is what makes you identify with it and believe that you are threatened. But we forget that it is the ego that is threatened and living through your energy, not the other way around. The easiest way to notice this gameplay is when you notice yourself in an uncomfortable situation. If you catch the mind complaining or what may feel as yourself complaining, this is the egoic energy you are attached to. When you derive your sense of self from this, embracing happiness through observing your thoughts becomes harder as your sense of self begins to feel as if it is being questioned or hijacked. You may see yourself having a hard time accepting tough situations and predicaments. This is because the ego is threatened and wanting to maintain its identity through this blow. It is what keeps you in a rigid and conformist mindset when you identify with this suffering. If you had to choose between suffering or not, the answer would be obvious. It is only when we try to escape its beliefs that more very real-looking threats begin to appear. It will begin to take on its parents through your spiritual self, attacking others. This is not actually what defines you, and only through awareness and observing can you free yourself from this identification. It may start off as temporary observing before you get pulled in again, though the more you observe in life and meditate, the more this empty space will feel like home, away from the fracturing of the ego's division. A lot of times it will be pouring salt on the wounds it's experienced through trauma and other trials. Just know that it's actually what is allowing you the chance of liberation. Even when it feels like you can't see this kind of liberation, the stigmas and illusions will begin to fade around this truth also, that you are pure consciousness. not a thought form that replays itself through the variety of encounters. Most likely in this lifetime, both of us will become free from this attachment completely. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Much love and peace.